There's been some huge changes in how we perceive trees, as whether trees are good for water or bad for water and the implications. So a story I have about that is back in 2005, I worked in an international organization called Center for International Forestry Research. So most of the money that that organization got was to help look at how we can use trees and forests to benefit poor people in particular in the tropics. And we were very worried when one day there were some headlines in the international media saying, if you plant trees, it's going to be bad for water, for people. So if you have poor people who have a water shortage, and many people in the tropics do have a water shortage, if you plant trees, you're going to make it worse. Okay, so we're researchers. So of course we sit down and we look at the actual article that this is based on, and we realize that actually, though they had a huge amount of data from around the world, very little of the data was from the tropics for a start, and very little of the data was from dry parts of the tropics. But they did have more than 500 studies where they had actually looked at areas where there was no forest and then looked at areas where the forest came back and compared it and saw how it impacted the water. And they saw in all those areas that there was a reduction in the water coming from that landscape when you planted the trees. So their conclusion was, if you plant trees, you lose water. Now, as I say, very few of those sites were in the tropics. And my colleagues were also concerned that it's really just looking at a site without forest and a site with forest, and not thinking about what about the intermediate densities of trees that you get in most drylands. Most drylands don't have dense closed forest, they have scattered tree cover. So a colleague of mine worked in Burkina Faso to actually explore this in much greater detail, looking at how the density of trees could affect the water captured. And instead of seeing a straight line, I'll try and draw a graph for you, from where you have no forest to high forest cover, and seeing a straight line where the amount of water in the landscape would drop, because with the dense tree cover it drops. Instead of seeing a drop as you plant more and more trees, you actually see a very sharp rise initially as you put trees into the landscape. And the point would be that it's not just a small difference you see, but maybe 5 or 6 times more water stays in the landscape with some trees than in a landscape with no trees. So we get a very big boost in the actual water captured in that landscape. And that's water that people can use in their livelihoods. It's water that people can use for all kinds of things. So this is a really big result, I think. But it's at the moment we just have it in one site. I think was relatively controversial because the original study in Science, the 506 studies, looked very convincing to many people. But here we are, more than 10 years later, and I think a lot of these questions are still open. People are still arguing about a lot of these things. But I see a huge benefit from the trees in those landscapes. So often when I explain to people how important forests are for water and how important forests are for people in dry parts of the world, I think a lot of my colleagues and things will say, well, we've known this for years, we've known this for decades, we've always known that forests are important for water. But what I often emphasize is maybe you don't know how important they are, because really a lot of the recent results are underlining again and again that maybe we thought they were important, but now we know they're several times more important than we used to realize. And I think that's a really deep insight, because we're much more dependent on these forests, these trees, this tree cover, than I think people previously realized.